Thank you very much for asking me, and thank you for having me, for giving me this opportunity to speak about my book, India and Asian Geopolitics, the Past, Present, which has just come out in April. Uh, I thought what I'd try and do is to spend maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, just describing the main themes of the book. And then Asian geopolitics has shaped our foreign policy. Now, it's most people, when they look at India's foreign policy, look at our relationship with big powers, with the US, with China, with Russia, with the EU. But I don't think we take an integrated view of where we are in our neighborhood and how our neighborhood has evolved. And so the first part of the book looks at that, at the Asian home in which we operated. And the second part, the present, is really a description of where we were, let's say in 2018, 2019, when the book was written, with a few additions last year, and where we might be going as a whole. Because why geopolitics, you'll ask me? Because traditionally, geopolitics only means the influence of geography on state practice or behavior, on how states choose to implement policy. But today, if you look at geopolitics, it means the big drivers of policy, the bigger things that influence states, not just geography, but history, resource endowment. And this, I mean, for the economists, I mean, this, I think, this brings a whole host of disciplines in demography, how that affects what states do. And so what I tried to do was to use that as a lens to look at how India made her policies. The survey part, I think, is familiar to everybody, even though I go into some detail. And what that suggested to me was that not just our history, but our geography, our demography, our resource endowment, they all suggest to me that India has done best when she is most connected to the world, when she is most engaged with the world. Why do I say that? I say that because if you look at our geography, we are the only subcontinent in the world, by the way. We are a peninsula at the center of the Indian Ocean world. And it is really those maritime parts of this peninsula which have been most connected with the world through history and which have been the most stable, the most prosperous, the most advanced parts. I mean, the Cholas ruled for 13 centuries, unbroken. But we've been taught a version of history by the British, and unfortunately there are people today who still, Indians who still believe it, that India has continuously been ruled by foreigners, that we were divided by religion and caste, and this was all ways of justifying their own rule, quite frankly. They periodized our history by religion, that India was always insular, was closed, was sea-blind, and this was necessary for a small group of people trying to rule a populous, prosperous, advanced country like India. And they succeeded. But they also sold us this myth. So for me, the basic drivers actually suggest that India needs to be out there engaged with the world. Why do I say this even today? Because you look at our resource endowment. I mean, over 80% of our imports are maintenance imports. We depend on the world for basics like energy, fertilizer, non-ferrous metals, coal we import today. It's moong dal, I mean, you name it. These are things we cannot do without. And the more advanced we get, the more industrialized we get, the more we are part of global supply and value chains. Look at the auto parts industry, for instance. These are global supply chains. And how do we pay for these things that we have to import? We have to get into export. So we are naturally part of the world. The years of the highest growth in the Indian economy were the years when we opened up. from in 1991, about 15.3% of GDP was external merchandise trade. By 2014, that was all the way up to about 49.6% of GDP. That's almost half. If you add services, you add remittances, the external sector as a whole is more than half of our GDP. So I don't think most Indians quite realize this. So we have no choice but to be involved. But the fact is, we had to evolve strategies which were very different from what we'd inherited. We might have been legally the successor to the Raj, but independent India was not. Partition had given us a hostile neighbor to our west and cut us off physically from land access to Central Asia to West Asia. The Chinese occupied Tibet in 1950, and for the first time in history, we had a border with Chinese troops on it. And a boundary which was disputed. We had no trouble with Tibet. We actually had understandings on treaty, custom, usage, and we knew where the boundary was. But once China came and disputed them, and of course, thirdly, the Royal Navy was withdrawn. And because the previous government of India under the Raj was responsible only for the land frontiers, we were basically sea blind. It took us a long time to realize our maritime heritage and how important the seas were to us. Today, over 93% of our trade actually comes and goes by sea. So we had to devise a strategy in a very complicated situation. Again, an unprecedented Cold War, bipolar world divided between the US and the Soviet Union. And we chose not to choose sides, not to be dragged into other people's quarrels automatically. We chose to be non-aligned. But as we kept saying, non-alignment doesn't mean neutrality. It means picking a stand on issues depending on our interest, which means we can choose one side once, the other side other times. We might choose neither if that suits us best. But we had no choice, given our condition, because 200 years of colonialism had reduced one of the world's most advanced and prosperous societies into one of the poorest, couldn't feed ourselves. I mean, literacy was something like 14% and 8% among women. Life expectancy was somewhere in the range of around 26 years. So obviously the priority for us was to transform India into a prosperous, secure, modern country where every Indian could achieve their full potential. And if the transformation of India is your main goal, then that's the purpose of your foreign policy, to make it possible to enable that transformation of India. And for that primary requirement, peace, that you need to be able to apply all your energy to building India up. So essentially what non-alignment became was an attempt to expand the area of peace. It worked in some cases, it didn't work in some cases. In some cases, we were realistic in how we went about it. In some cases, we weren't. I don't think that China policy was a great success. We tried very hard to coexist with China, but China was a rising nationalist power under Mao Zedong especially, and for a whole host of reasons, we ended up with 62. So there were parts of that policy which didn't work. But frankly, the book itself goes through a whole host of these, whether it's Pakistan policy, our relations with the US. The book also mentions missed opportunities. In 1956, Prime Minister Kishi came to Delhi, and actually, this is Abe's grandfather, and actually suggested to Nehru that, Asia needed to integrate economically. This is post-war Asia. Korean War had just finished. War was going on in Vietnam, low-level civil war at that stage in 56. But he said we needed to develop ourselves industrially. We needed to advance. And Japan had already done that before the war. But we were going the other way. We were looking for self-reliance, import substitution, industrial policy resolution around the same time. And Kishi, however, found that in Southeast Asia, there were countries who were willing to do that. And this is understandable. Frankly, in 1950, when you look at India's condition, there's a very good economic argument also to be made for not getting sucked into a larger. But the real reason I think that Nehru was so reluctant to be part of Asian economic integration at that stage was because he saw it as a US-led effort to contain communism. And he saw it as choosing sides in the Cold War, choosing and starting with economics, but being integrated into the Western system against the Soviets and the Chinese. And he didn't think that was a very good way to build peace in the region. So I go through some of these missed opportunities. Same thing in the 70s, 80s, once ASEAN was formed, I think. But we had our own reasons, frankly, because of Afghanistan, because of Kampuchea, because of a whole host of other reasons. But the other part of the book, the much more serious part as far as I'm concerned, but also the much more speculative part, is the present, which describes the world we are in today and what we as India might do about it. And essentially, we are today in a world created by globalization and by the global financial crisis in 2008, which I see as a sort of watershed, a divider, because we had a Cold War from the time the Republic of India was born until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Bipolar system, two superpowers fighting among themselves. Once the Soviet Union vanished, you were then in a unipolar world. And it was a period when China was also totally internally engrossed. She'd just gone through Tiananmen in 1989, and there were leadership divisions and social tensions as a result of reform and opening up, which they were trying to sort out among themselves. They had to shoot their own people in the main square of their capital in 1989 June. So China was domestically involved. There was a unipolar moment in the world where the US was the sole superpower. And we therefore made a huge adjustment thanks to mainly Narasimha Rao, who of course kept denying that he was adjusting policy. He kept saying, I'm just doing what Nehru did. But he transformed the relationship with the US, opened that up. He elevated, we had already recognized Israel a long time ago in 48, but he elevated that relationship to an embassy level relationship. He opened an office in Taiwan without arousing reactions from the Chinese. He signed a border peace and tranquility agreement with China, which said we will both respect the status quo and basically we won't bother each other. We'll go off and do more important things, which in our case was internal reform, opening up the economy, and transforming our relationship with the sole superpower. And actually, what he started, Look East policy, it was almost 180-degree revamping of Indian foreign policy. But he kept denying that he had changed anything fundamental. I suppose it made it easier to sell it politically at home. But all this he did because we were in a new phase. But after the 2008 global financial crisis, frankly, China was convinced that she now was the power of the future, that the West was in terminal decline, led by the US. Of course, this didn't happen. If you look at the period since 2008, the US has not been in decline. Europe might be. If you look at relative global shares in GDP, from 1980 to roughly 2016 or so, the US share is roughly the same, between 25, 28% of global GDP. But India and China, I'm in PPP terms, if you look at India and China, our share has grown from what was originally together around 4% to now about 17%, almost, in fact, 25, 26%. And the biggest losers have been Europe, because their share has actually shrunk down. And today, if you look at the sources of growth in the world economy prior to COVID, uh, most of them were outside the traditional industrial powers. The US still, but otherwise, China accounted in 2019 for something like 30% of global growth. India was a major contributor. And even now, it's likely that as once we are past the pandemic, that that actually the major share of dynamism in the global economy will come from emerging economies and from the Asia Pacific region, as it were. Uh, what has happened, therefore, as a result of globalization is a shift in the balance of power. The center of gravity of global politics and of the economy is now here in Asia. Uh, it and this is a simple calculation. Just measure where economic activity was happening in the world in the 50s, early 60s. It was somewhere in mid-Atlantic. So it was basically in Europe and America. Now it's east of the Urals and moving east, further east, steadily east. And what globalization has done, therefore, is to shift the balance of power. You've seen the rise of China, but it's not only China. It's the rise of other countries like India, Korea, Indonesia. I mean, there's a whole host of other countries. Secondly, we now have pushback to this shift in the balance of power. And we see much more adversarial relations between China and the US. The established powers don't like the idea of other powers coming and taking over and running the world. They would much rather use their strengths and establish their position. So their argument is keep stability, don't change anything. But the rising powers want to have a say, whether it's India, whether it's China. All of us want to have a say in how the world is run. Globalization did one other strange, unpredicted, but now in retrospect, obvious result. It was a huge threat to identity throughout the world. Thanks to ICT, everybody has in the palm of his hand a phone which shows him what's happening throughout the world, other people's lifestyles. It can excite emotions. It makes aspirations. And that technology-driven disruption led to the rise of new authoritarian leadership, most of it nativist, stressing their national credentials, much more nationalist than before. So it's the opposite. Globalization is supposed to make this into one happy world. Instead, it aroused local passions because people felt threatened, felt their identity was threatened. And also globalization and those decades led to a huge shift in urbanization. Today, the world is basically more of the world's population lives in cities today than in villages. And the proportions are increasing steadily. So people have been pulled out of their traditional home, family, clan, village, familiar surroundings. And they're now in urban, anonymous surroundings, exposed to a whole host of new things. So you get the politics of emotion, you get a completely different authoritarian politics based on hyper-nationalism in many countries. And the best example of that is really China. So you now have an assertive China, hyper-nationalist, a rising power, with real hard power, whether it's military. Economically, today, China is a global superpower. Militarily, she's still a regional power, a local power in Northeast Asia, parts of Southeast Asia, and obviously pressing on us as well. So the world is multipolar economically because there are several economic powers who are global economic powers, the EU, for instance, the US. But in military terms, the US is still the sole superpower. She's the only one who can project military power to any part of the earth when she wishes to, who has that ability to intervene around the globe. And politically, of course, it's thoroughly confused, as I said, with the rise of new authoritarians, with local politics getting more fragmented. And third thing that globalization did was to all the hotspots, flashpoints, are now live again. And most of them are in our region, are in Asia, whether it is the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea between China and Japan, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's South China Sea, where there are multiple claimants, whether it is the India-China boundary, whether it is Chinese involvement in Myanmar, or in Nepalese politics, or whether it's Saudi Arabia and Iran, who are now talking to each other, or whether it's Israel and Iran, or whether it's Syria. I mean, wherever you look, Yemen, all these are live flashpoints today. And because of the rise of nationalism, of the sort of leaders that we have today, from Xi Jinping onwards, Trump was, I think, the last example of that, the most recent example of that. The chances of these flashpoints, of crises being handled diplomatically or through negotiation or peacefully, are much lower. Why? Because if you base your legitimacy on nationalism, on being strong, powerful leaders, it's much harder to do the give and take, the bargaining, the compromising that you require to settle things peacefully, to come to an agreement. For us in India, the result is also that the geopolitical significance of the subcontinent and the Indian Ocean region has gone up tremendously. We were a sideshow during the Cold War. The main fault line was in Europe. The killing fields might have been in Asia, but the main fault line was between the Soviet Union and the US and Europe. Germany was partitioned. Today, the main fault line is here in Asia between China and the US. The US is pushing back, trying to prevent the emergence of a peer competitor. That's been her policy from the Second World War. First, it was the Soviet Union, Cold War, then it was Japan in the 80s. Then the Japanese threat vanished when Japan went into stagflation. And now it's China. And the US is using the weapons that she knows, which is she is a military power. She has technology. She's using what she can. She's using her economic power where she can because she sees that as a Chinese advantage which needs to be done in. How do we cope with this situation where the world has become much tougher, much more uncertain? This is not the open, globalized world, globalizing world that we were used to, and that, at least for the late 80s, 90s, and the noughts, we could operate in and operated in successfully. We did very well in those years. This is a time where, we can't do without the world. So we need to actually stay engaged, but we need to maintain strategic autonomy and concentrate on the things close at home. Strengthen ourselves first, increasing our material power, military, economic. But secondly, and what we do at home actually really matters. It greatly affects what we are able to do abroad. And it's very hard to talk to any foreigners and so on if you can't walk the walk at home. Secondly, we need to increase our engagement with Asia. And here I'm afraid I personally am worried because I think we're going the other way. We walked out of our CEP after 8 years of negotiation. I'm sure there are very good economic reasons, but in effect, we are telling the Southeast Asians and the rest of the world that we don't think we are competitive today, and we don't think we'll be competitive after 20 years, which is the adjustment period provided for in the RCEP itself. Now, that's not a statement you want to make because we have today, as a result of Look East, Act East, a much stronger defense, security, intelligence relationship with all these countries to our east, all the way to Japan, whether it's Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, Australia, Korea, Singapore. We have that relationship, but you can't walk on one leg. And these are countries for whom the economics of it is very important. So we need an economic leg. We need a foreign economic policy which also engages and actually makes us part of it. We have worked on balancing coalitions to handle our biggest concern, which is China. China is the biggest threat to us, and we can talk about that maybe in the question and answer. We all know what happened last year. because China is the only great power which opposes the rise of India. All the others welcome it for whatever reasons. US might welcome it because they see it as a check on China, whatever, but they welcome it. But China doesn't see India's rise as being in her interest. She sees a competitor in her backyard, in what she thinks is her rightful area. What she seeks is primacy first in Asia, ultimately in the world. We have worked with others who share our concerns, whether it's Japan. The Quad is a good example of that. But most of these arrangements are maritime arrangements in the Indo-Pacific, in the open body of water from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of America. On the continent, we have a much more complicated problem. And we are the only Quad member, by the way, who has both a maritime and a continental security issue, and where China figures in both of them. So we, therefore, on the continent, have to work with other partners, with Russia, with Iran, with other powers, even though that creates complications for us in our dealings with the US and the others. The US is a huge opportunity for us, frankly. So are other middle powers. So is the possibility of building a broader third world coalition, because they feel abandoned in this confused world between orders, and where, frankly, the great powers are so busy in their own games that they have very little time or energy for the others. But the strategy that all successful rising powers have followed in the past is to keep their heads down while they accumulate material power. And they accommodate the existing system for as long as they need to, play by the existing rules until you have sufficient power to change them. And that is a matter of judgment, when to make your move. Japan in the 30s and 40s made her move too early, didn't have enough power, and you saw what happened. Germany made her move twice, failed. China's made her move now. She's pushing with the BRI, with an outreach, and she's now actually quite, with her wolf warrior diplomacy, she's quite open about her ambition. Has she made her move too soon? My own sense is that it's not going to be a China-centered Asia, and the book argues this. It argues there are multiple possible futures. This is one of them, but I don't think it's the most likely. But maybe we can talk about China's trajectory and where we are going. So all in all, I would say that we have a few hard years ahead of us. There is no working world order. We saw that with COVID. What did WHO, G20, G7, anybody do to help you through COVID? A lot of talk, but there isn't very much actually done. So there is no international order or multilateral system which works anymore today. We are between orders. There is great power rivalry at a level which we have not known for many years. And there are flashpoints around us, and we are near the center of the problem. And therefore, we will get dragged into it. We will see other powers in the subcontinent getting involved in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka. So we have a complicated life for a few years. But let's see. Somebody once said that pessimists are always right, optimists always win. So I'd rather win than be right. I'll stop there.